Welcome to Life by Design for Chiropractors, episode 99.
Welcome to Life by Design, the podcast for chiropractors. Here's your host, Dr. Jamie Richards.
Welcome to Life by Design for Chiropractors. I'm your host, Dr. Jamie Richards, and on today's episode, I join my good friend, Dr. Mike Gibson, and we talk about results, and specifically results in practice with regards to practice members and patients. And of course, we bring up some interesting conversations that will likely challenge the way you're thinking about results, the difference between results in a second paradigm, third paradigm practice, how to communicate those results. We talk about objective testing. We talked about how to communicate some of the subjective side without actually compromising what the outcomes are and the long-term vision for helping this person understand. So I'm positive that you're going to get a lot out of today's episode. It will challenge a lot of the things that you've been told from the stage over and over, and hopefully, I believe, reframe some of that in a way that you can actually feel good about what you're doing in practice and communicate that well. As well, we just released our upcoming training camp that'll be in the new year 2020, if you can believe that. So check out that. This last one sold out, which is coming up next weekend. So we'd love to have you there if you want to train on some of this stuff. I'll put the link in the show notes. And as always, thank you for listening to Life by Design for Chiropractors, the voice of reason in chiropractic. Hey, Mike, welcome back to Life by Design for Chiropractors.
Thanks, Jamie.
Good to have you on the show again. Always great topics. I know we're constantly talking in the pre-show and jokingly, we talk about hitting record. And of course, I think I talked about this on the last episode, guys. We started actually hitting record on some of these, and we did put them in a group somewhere else. So stay tuned for that. I know it hasn't been launched yet, but we've got a bunch of other pre-show type content that we're going to get available to you guys. But today we're talking about technique, and actually probably not technique, Mike, as much as results, although technique is a part of that. And I know you speak to a lot of clients. I speak to a lot of clients, and it's interesting how often this comes up. And you would think, especially in docs who've been in practice 10 years, 12, 15, 20 years, that they would have essentially worked past this concept. But I think there's some pieces here that they don't think about and such. We've had the chance to work through them ourselves. I think it's valuable for today's show.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things when you start to address, I'll just call them problem areas in practice. And then when you really start to think it through and brainstorm ways to improve upon it and really start to reflect on and ask the question, why are we doing this way? Mm-hmm. It oftentimes, more times than not, seems to uncover some uncertainty, some lack of clarity and confidence in some of the things that we're doing and why we're doing them. So it's been really interesting lately. I know it's come up a lot, hence the topic for today. But I think to a degree anyway, obviously some more than others, we all have these things where, we're just not totally certain about something. So we tend to create systems that kind of, route around them and kind of avoid them almost.
Yeah. I think early in practice, especially actually maybe even beyond early, maybe the first 5 or 6 years, let me go back a bit. I think part of the story for me anyway, and hopefully some people can relate to this, the story for me, getting exposed to chiropractic through some really great speakers, Arnold Bernier, Reggie Gold, Pat Gentempo, and then of course all the other people that you would see at the same time. As a young doctor, I would get exposed to, these really amazing stories. I remember, I won't say names, but I remember hearing a speaker talk about, doing an atlas correction, and, it's like delivered the atlas correction and the patient screamed, and they walked for the first time. And I'm not even exaggerating. These are the stories that I would hear. And I know, Mike, you've probably heard a lot of the same stories. And, I would get into practice, and there was a lot of disillusionment because for the first 5 or 6 years, I didn't have anybody who couldn't walk, got on the table and I made a correction and they walked away. And so I know for me, it really ate away at my self-esteem, and it made me question, am I doing it right? And of course, then I explored, a million different techniques and tried, network. I tried toggle. I tried Thompson. I tried MLS. I tried, every different technique. But of course, I noticed that the quote unquote results were very similar across them all. And the flip of the switch for me was when I realized that the reason the results were similar is because those were probably the expected results of correcting a subluxation. I just happened to be using different techniques to correct the subluxation. In the end, turned out I was actually getting really great results objectively. And of course, once I started measuring those and seeing those, and the big takeaway for me, and I don't even remember where I got it, but the big switch for me that led me away from trying to do all those workarounds and trying to kind of work through the back door to get all this stuff in place was this simple understanding that if somebody shows up on my table and I test them and they're subluxated, and I deliver a force and I retest them and they're not subluxated, then quote unquote, I got results. And those were the best results that I could promise. And once I got that, then the mindset really changed for me because I wasn't worried so much about all of the other objective and subjective results. And not to say that we weren't looking at them and didn't care, but I knew that they were less subluxated when they walked in. And I know for a lot of docs, that's, I think, where they struggle is they're very much attached to, what the subjective results are, one. And then even if we do have them thinking more objectively, they still get overly attached to the objective results.
Yeah, and no, Jim, just to add to that, love what you said there. I think you're 100% accurate with that. The one thing I'll add is not just confident in delivering a result as far as, like you said, the subjective or what the patient will experience, but I think a lot of people, they've heard same story. They've heard these speakers on stage talk about the changes on a test, whether it's an X-ray, whether it's thermography, SEMG, whatever it might be. They've come to expect that the standard or the norm is, hey, we should have a scan that's completely clear. It should be all white. Right. And then you get back into practice and they're like, I'm not getting that same result. So not only a lack of confidence in delivering a result that the patient may want, usually a subjective change, but also too just in actually delivering a result on an objective test. I think there's a lot of uncertainty and lack of confidence around that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I totally agree. And I think it brings up the first main point, and that is when we hear the word results, Mike, what is it that you think doctors should be thinking about? I mean, you say results to a patient, of course, at least until they're indoctrinated into your approach. Results to them mean some type of symptomatic or subjective change. And I think for a lot of doctors, not that we're saying that there should be no attention to that. And you made a good point in the pre-show just about, how subjective changes are indicative of sensory input improvements or changes. And I actually never even thought about that. So thank you for adding that into my mind. But I think for most people, they're thinking just pure subjective changes and not even considering that you could have an objective change or should be measuring that.
Well, I think it comes back to our agreements, right? It's about you framing it properly in the beginning. And of course, this is why we're huge fans of the core and collateral damage, that whole concept and that whole communication strategy, because the most important thing is that whatever that means for you, you have to be very clear about what is expected to change. What is it going to look like at your first re-exam, second re-exam, third re-exam, end of care, whatever you're calling it, whatever time frame that you're recommending to people. You need to get an agreement up front and be very, very clear about that, so that when you get to each of those through each of those feedback back cycles and each of those pivot points, that you're actually you're on the same page about what the expectations are. So I think that's probably the very first step in is making sure that you're on the same page. But I think it really comes down to, and this is where Jamie, you and I have talked a lot about, is actually take if you were to compare the objective tests that we do in practice compared to yours, they're very different. And one's not right or wrong, one's not better than the other. They're just different for a variety of different reasons. Technique is one. But at the end of the day, the most important thing is that we are setting criteria, we are communicating it, we're getting an agreement with the practice member, with the patient, about what is expected, and we're framing that in this idea, in this context of this core collateral, that whole conversation, so that they can really understand what those expectations are. And at the end of the day, it's just all about making sure that you can, both in your mind and more importantly, the mind of your patient, that you can build a case, which is one of our C's as far as day one goes and day two goes, really making sure that we're building a case. So in their mind, you've clearly identified, what subjective and objective measures exist to actually identify subluxation and how those are going to change once the subluxations have been corrected and the body has begun to heal.
I think that, there's a big difference here. And this is one of those differentiators between second and third paradigm. It's one of the things that I love about third paradigm is that, we are heavily reliant, and not solely as we said, but heavily reliant on the objective standards. And, getting a patient buy-in to caring enough about the spine and about the nervous system that it's not that their subjective outcomes don't matter, because nobody or very few people are going to be able to live with extreme levels of, say, pain, have no change to that, and think that somehow because you're changing the spine and it happens to be changing that they're going to just continue. Now, that does happen in some cases, but again, you've got to be a great communicator. You've got to come up with the agreements up front. But I think if you're relying too much on the subjective side of things, which is oftentimes in that second paradigm or first paradigm, not that many people practice in that one, but it's outside of your hands. And to some degree, the objective ones are as well. But I think we have much more control over what happens in the objective side of things through our technique and through the correction of subluxation versus the subjective side of things. So number one, I think that, getting objectively focused and get heavy on the objective side. And then the other piece that I think is probably an interesting conversation is, what are these tests telling us? Our job, as I said, is to analyze for, and depending on how you define this, correcting subluxation. And so for me, in my definition, that's something that I analyze at the table, and I make the corrections and I see the post check to determine a subluxation has been corrected. The testing, so whether it be EMG, thermals, those to me are not solely subluxation outcomes. And this is where it kind of opens up a can of worms for people. What happens in between our visits, Mike? Obviously, they have a large degree of influence on. And have you ever done this in your practice, Mike? Actually, let me ask you, have you ever done a pre-test, made a correction, and then done a post-test in terms of, let's say, EMGs or thermals?
Like right away?
Yeah, right away.
Not in practice. We used to do it all the time when we were in school.
Right.
Actually, and we used to do it. I remember going to Total Solution. We did it there.
Right.
We were, that was a weekend about, getting to learn and understand the technology better. So I certainly have done it in those instances. Have I done it in practice? Not that I can recall.
When you did it what did you generally see in school or at Total Solutions?
Oh, we used to see some significant. The one that always stood out to me was the inspiratory volume, right? Actually, something really happened very recently. Someone actually brought a spirometer into practice because their doctor didn't believe that there was such a dramatic change that she noticed it. Like this woman would come in and she couldn't. She's wheezing. Her breathing was awful, and she'd get an adjustment and every time for years. This lady's been a practice member for 15 years, and every time right afterwards, instantly her breathing is better. It's like the physiology changes dramatically.
Right.
It's very observable. So her doctor never believed her. So I think the doctor gave her the spirometer, handheld little spirometer. She brought it into practice, and we did it. Actually, I think we did it on 2 different visits where we did it before and after, and I don't remember the exact results of it, but the difference was unbelievable in terms of the changes pre and post. So that's one example of an objective test. Now, it's not one that we do every day in practice,
sure.
But unbelievable changes pre and post.
And then when you would do the EMGs, and again, you can tell me, but this is what I would see is, because I've done this with some patients, and I did it when I was really slow way back in the early days because I was curious. I just got the technology and I wanted to test it out. And what I would see is, people come in, I would do their EMG or thermal, and I do analysis at the table. I would check them, correct them, and then I would do a post-analysis EMG and thermal. And I would do right after, I would do 10 minutes, and then I would do, an hour. And then I had somebody who stayed for a couple hours one day. I guess they didn't have a lot to do. And we just continued the test. And what I would see is, in the pre-test, I would see whatever the pattern was. I would see, neurological stress patterns and so on, similar to that we might see in a case. And then post-correction, I would see almost almost every time I would see that the tests were either really clear, totally clear, or, somewhere in that range. And then, an hour would go by and it would still maybe be clear, but you would see a little bit of a change back towards that pattern and so on and so on. And I don't know, did you see something similar with your EMG and thermals?
Yeah, I don't think we ever followed it for that long a period of time. But it does bring up, I think, a very important point is that, the reality is it's one thing to have them, sit in your office and wait a few hours and do another test. But the reality is between visits, between tests, people don't live in a bubble. And there's all sorts of new stresses that they encounter that are just totally going to change the neurology and it's going to show up differently on all of those tests.
Well, and here's my point, and this is, I think, the valuable piece here in terms of not just what the testing is telling me, and then how I then communicate it to patients. And I think this has been extremely valuable in my practice. The objective testing, EMG and thermal specifically, as we talk about in this instance, are not telling me about subluxation. They're telling me about some of the effects of subluxation, right? Or effects of stress and stress adaptability. Subluxation correction is, for me, an analysis that is done at the table by hand. And so if I determine there's a subluxation and I correct it, then my job is done, as I said. And what happens, happens. But again, it's still nice to be able to tell a story to your patients so they understand and you're using these tests. But here's what I think happens. I make the correction. We see a change in the nervous system most of the time, decreased muscle tone, better autonomic balance, and that probably maintains a certain level of clarity, for lack of a better word, for a period of time. And then there's a transition. And so let's say someone who is newer in your office, I would guess that transition would be much faster back to where they were before, like the next day or even a few hours. But someone who has had care for an extended time, they should generally have a less of a transition back to a distorted or disturbed state. And so when we do the analysis and the tests, whether it be the end of corrective, the end of rebuild, or ongoing in this optimization cycle, what I'm looking at is probably a better idea of how clear or how well does this person adapt to their environment with 7 days in between visits or 14 days in between visits or so on and so forth. So when we get into the testing, if I see tests that look, clear, or look bad, which is probably a better example, after 7 days, it doesn't tell me that I'm not doing a good job, right? And I think that's the important point. It tells me that that's the ability for that person's body to adapt with a 7-day gap in between checkups versus a 5-day gap or a 2-day gap or a 14-day gap. And so that's the story I tell people is, look, you're walking in the door. I'm testing you in a subluxated state. So if you score a 62 on my algorithm, all it means is that, based on the tests we're doing and based on your current lifestyle, either your nervous system isn't adaptable yet and it's more than 7 days isn't ideal, or you need to be here more often, or you need to change your lifestyle. But I think the point I'm trying to make here, hopefully I got this across, is the tests aren't telling me about if they're subluxated. That I'm telling at the table. What the tests are telling me is, how well they're adapting in those 7 or 14 days in between the subluxation correction.
Which can be extremely valuable when you're trying to determine the recommended frequency.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah, I don't think many of us, I'm not sure how realistic it is to do a lot of these objective tests that, frequently. Mm-hmm. But if you could, I think you're bang on in terms of what that would probably tell you. There are other ways, of course, with a very objective analysis to determine how long, I'm using my air quotes here, people are feeling an adjustment. Right. But there are certainly ways, and I think you're absolutely correct that we were to do those tests. That would be a wonderful indicator to determine exactly how long is necessary before their next adjustment. Of course, given that the objective and the goal is to be subluxation free and have a nervous system that's functioning as optimally as possible, as often as possible in a given day.
Yeah, and that's to me, that's kind of an exciting way to look at things, right? And a large part of communication is your story. Like, what story are you going to tell the patient? And I don't mean story like it's not true, but I want to frame the communication that I'm giving to a patient in a story because they're going to understand it better, they're going to consume it better, and they're going to integrate it better. And so I'd never liked the story of holding bone in, bone out, because it opens you up to far too much responsibility I think in the checkup portion and in the success, quote unquote, air quotes again, in the success of your test, you get to somebody who's, let's say, use examples of this week, someone who comes in every 5 to 7 days and we go through their testing. And this year, their score in my algorithm is a 72, whereas last year was an 85. And they look at me, right? And if I didn't communicate well, I'd say, I didn't do a very good job this year. You went from an 85 to a 72. But that has nothing to do with me. I mean, I already know that you're here X number of days in between visits, the same as the year before. I know the quality of my analysis and correction. So what this tells me is that their body didn't adapt as well with a 7-day period in between visits as it did the prior year. Now, that could be their lifestyle and things they do outside of the office. And again, the solution to this is twofold. Either they change their lifestyle or they increase their frequency. And I think what I love about framing it up this way is I often have this conversation with people. I say, look, you're at a 62, last year at a 75. You've got two choices and we can blend the two together, or you can make one of the other two. You can keep your same frequency, but you need to change your lifestyle. Or you can increase your frequency, so I see you more often and make the correction and reset the nervous system, or you can blend the two of those together, or you can just be happy with a 62, right? That was 4 choices. But the point is, by looking at it this way versus, oh my God, your tests are worse. What am I doing? This isn't working, which is, I think, the worst place that you can go. But that's the place often that the chiropractor goes. And I think that's the place that the patient goes if they don't frame it up right.
Yeah. And, thinking back to Cialdini, in his original book, their Influence, and one of his principles was, when you make an admission of some sort that someone doesn't expect, you have that moment of power. I think that's one of those perfect examples of when you can use that communication strategy, right? It's like, hey, you have a choice, right? It's hey, you know what? Your frequency to date over the last year has been, I think, perfect. We've seen this change, and that change. It's been unbelievable. The changes that we've seen. So I don't think that you need more chiropractic care. I think what you really need to focus on is all of the other requirements: your food, your movement, your thinking, your sleep. Okay. And those are really where you need to spend your focus. Now, if you decide you don't want to make those changes, like you said, which I love the way that you phrase that, then you could, you would benefit from actually getting checked more often to try and make up that difference to some degree, to whatever degree that is possible. But the point of all of this, I think, big picture, if we can step back a moment, is, these people, they are looking for leadership. They are looking for a path, for a plan, for a strategy. And these types of tools, these objective tools, they can tell us so much. And whether it's the chiropractic care or whether it's one of the other requirements, essentially what we've created is a lifetime plan for them to become as healthy as possible. And there are many different routes that they could take to get to optimal. And if we can lay those out, help them understand the requirements that exist for health, and then allow them and respect them in terms of how they want to achieve that, then I think that's the best way that we can lead them. We can respect their decisions. We can just respect who they are. But at the end of the day, essentially what we're doing is we're providing this blueprint that they're desperate for. Right. And I think that's just so valuable. And of course, you want to talk about retention. That's retention right there.
Exactly. You're taking, by giving them a guideline and just simply interpreting information and telling them where they're at. And especially when you get past the first 2 phases of correct and rebuild, once you're in optimization and you're on some type of ongoing schedule, 5 to 7, 10 to 14, 18 to 20, whatever schedule they're on, what your ideal is that most people have already in their mind kind of put a tick box beside your chiropractic care. Like, it's never a question. Am I going to do this? It's just, how often am I going to do it? What are the results that's going to get me? And I'll tell you, it's a very stress-free way to live your life in practice when you're not worried about going in and bullshitting somebody about their test results because, you're afraid of having this conversation about, oh, why is this red bar bigger today than it was 6 months ago? There's, healing going on and repatterning and all this other bullshit that people talk about. And it's like, well, maybe you just aren't moving well. Maybe you're not doing anything else. At the end of the day, every time I check you, I correct your subluxation. So I know that it's not that. And, I often tell people, whatever's happening in your test results, the good news is I know it's not subluxation because I'm correcting those on a very frequent basis. I know that it's probably something else you're doing or not doing. So either you decide that, and with my help, I'll be right there with you. You decide that we change it, or you don't change it, but just recognize when we retest you, if the same pattern exists or the same level of function exists, that's probably why that's going on.
Yeah, and I think that's what I love about that, though, is that you're showing them the way. You're not hiding from the results.
Right.
You're saying it like it is. You're being truthful. You're giving them the whole picture, and then you're letting them decide the path that best suits them. And I think in today's world, more than ever, I think people just they want that authenticity,
right.
and they want that autonomy, and they want that partnership to exist as far as working with a healthcare professional.
Well, and people will see through it anyway, right? I mean, the BS meter is on high. People are super cynical. So when you actually take a step back and you kind of go through this almost like a takeaway, if you're looking at kind of a sales technique, when you take it away from them and you have the certainty and you have the clarity of what the tests mean and what they tell you and what the value is in them, then it becomes really simple. And it leads to, what we talk about a lot in the retention-based practice is just stockpiling people. Right. At the end of the day, once they get past the first, 6, 8, 12 months, if somebody wants to come every 3 weeks and I want them to come every 5 to 7 days, we'll make an agreement, but they'll stay in my practice at every 20 days for the rest of their life. And I'm fine with that. And we'll have the conversation every time we look at test results. And I will say with this model, I have seen far more people change their schedule to 10 to 14 and 18 to 21, only to resume more frequent care down the road. But it's always been their choice. And it hasn't been something that I had to strong arm them into. And I tell you, it makes the system and the whole approach so much more relaxed.
Yeah. And what it also does, I find, because that's an approach I've taken for a long, long time, is it will significantly increase the number of reactivations.
Yes.
So people may make a decision for whatever reason at some point to discontinue their care, but leaving the door open, sharing the truth about what they actually need, right? Not tiptoeing around that, being, completely open and honest, regardless of how you think they might respond. This is what you need. I can't change that. That's just the reality of it. And then letting them choose and being respectful of that, you're going to see your reactivations increase significantly because people, they feel respected, they feel honored, and they don't have that sense of, I told you so. They feel welcome to come back because they know that you're going to always honor their decisions. And I think that's the way to go, and that's the way to bring a lot of people back into the practice. Because the reality is, this makes a lot of sense to us, but to those who this is new to, it may not. This may be the first time they've ever even looked at or thought about their health in this way. And so this is different. They're going to have to hear it many, many times before it really clicks, or they need some time on their own to kind of think it through and reflect on it before, what he said, that really does make a lot of sense. I need to give this another try. And when you're doing that, that's where you start to gain a great reputation. That's where you gain trust. Even though people aren't coming in for care, you're still their chiropractor, and they will end up back in your practice at some point. Yeah,
and along the same lines, make referrals, same thing, right? Where people know that their people are going to be taken care of. They're not going to be strong-armed. They're going to be part of a team. There's going to be communication. They're going to have free will and choice. And, I think, again, like you said, reactivations, stockpiling people, referrals, and just a much easier, stress-free way to practice. So, guys, I know there's a lot in today's episode, probably one you need to listen to a couple times. So definitely do that. We'll put a couple things in the show notes for you at lifebydesign4chiropractors.com /podcast, and you'll find today's episode and everything in there. And as always, I thank you for listening to the show, and Life by Design for Chiropractors, the voice of reason in chiropractic.